So to sum up, right, the illustrious Dr. Jen Stevenson, my colleague here at Queen's and former editor of Canadian Theatre Review, reached out to us and asked us if we would record one of these, I guess, conversations about CTR. And something that I think is interesting about the two of us is um, we are not of the generation that created the journal.
Yeah.
Right? Like my first interface with Canadian Theatre Review happens in the 90s as an undergraduate student here at Queen's, like fully 20 years into the existence of the journal.
Let's see. I think this was the first CATR that I read.
Really?
Features. I think so.
Yeah, see, mine would be much more. I think I'm in this pile. Um, yeah, something around this. Like, there, look at that. Earlier. So, Guillermo Verdecchia and Conteras Americanas, which I actually just taught in
Great play.
a Canadian theater and its performance in Canada, which is a course I teach here at Queen's. Found that course was originally created by Natalie Renyk, also a former editor of the Canadian Theatre Review. And I love that Natalie retitled that course from Canadian Theatre to Theatre and its Performance in Canada. Allows us to problematize all those terms. And so yeah, this would be probably right around the time that I was first reading CTRs. Just provide context, I guess, to anybody who's listening who has no idea who we are.
Yes.
So I'm Grahame Renyk. I am an instructor here at the Dance School of Drama and Music at Queen's. I've been an instructor here since like 2008, 2009, on and off. And then I also periodically still work making theater, and most of the theater making I do professionally outside of the academy of late has been in musical comedy reviews, like comedy sketches and music, and that kind of area of performance, which I'm really invested in, right? And I think is a really interesting world of performance, and I really love the engagement with the audience and the attempt to create that sense of a gathering with the audience and the theater making. And then my research is in kind of the intersection between the idea of musicals and everything that gets kind of associated with that idea and the sort of idea of Canadian. So rather than Canadian musicals and trying to like define what those are and write the history of them, that's too slippery. It's more interesting to me that musicals as a term often is so associated with the American musical. And then what else is associated with that? Like the commercial or the popular or the populist or and then ideas sometimes of like sellout or these are just like goofball entertainments or even just entertainment or the culinary or the escapism of them, or right, like all of that cloud of things being associated with musicals. How does that collide with the cloud of ideas that kind of get associated with Canadian, especially in this time of defining like what is quote Canadian theater, which is really like it's been interesting to go back and kind of revisit CTR in particular 1974 to about 2004 2005 and kind of going through that arc of the ways in which musicals feature or frankly don't, but also looking at the ways in which that idea of Canadian and Canadian theater and what are the associated ideas and feelings that come with that. And so what I'm interested in is, I think it's interesting looking at where those collide, those two clusters, and what ideas they tease out. So that's the project I'm working on right now. Nice. But it has kind of drawn me into the archive in interesting ways of late.
I'm Thea Fitz-James. I am wrapping up time here at Queen's University and starting a new position at University of Saskatchewan.
Yes, congratulations. Good riddance. Oh, it's a tragedy.
Oh,
for us.
Lord. I am excited to get to know the prairies.
You'll love them. That's where I'm from. I grew up in southern Alberta.
Yeah, I grew up in Quebec. But my whole Gordons. I'm a Gordon. We're all Saskatchewan farmers,
There you go.
Scottish Saskatchewan farmers.
Well, that land gets stuck in your blood, so
Yeah.
you'll feel it.
Yeah. No, my grandma was from Regina. My grandpa was from Saskatoon.
Oh yeah, that landscape is in you.
Yeah. So I'm excited. I'm gonna miss the water. I like the water. Anyways, but yeah, my research is in the area of right now. I'm interested in fringes, but I think I write about material cultures, material bodies as they apply to Canadian performance broadly. I'm also a theater maker,
Currently in a fringe show. Yeah.
And we were prompted by the illustrious Jen Stevens. I feel like that's her first name.
Like the notorious B.I.G.
Yeah.
The illustrious Jen Stevens.
That's exactly.
She's gonna be so mad when she sees this.
Well,
she's used to it. It's fine. This we've co-taught for years. This is what I put her through this all the time.
But yeah, we were prompted to kind of get messy with the archive, to dig our little fingernails into CTR as we've experienced it, having both been editors, having both been contributors, and by editors I mean co-editors of editions, not editors of the whole thing. But also I think worth acknowledging, yeah, that's the right word, that we're both of our brains are putty. We have putty brain.
Yeah, right now. So it may be a little bit of a wandering conversation.
Wandering, yeah.
Yeah, we've actually been here like a couple hours playing around and talking to all this.
And we lost our first recording, so this is take 2.
With a bit of a probably more truncated as a consequence.
Yeah, because we've already talked about it.
The fates have shone down on us and on our viewers.
Which is funny, but I think it's kind of nice because like there's an archive that this is now being archived, and then there's a previous. It's like we had a rehearsal for the performance, which I like, even though I'm sleepy.
There you go. Me too. So it's again, I think it's interesting. Our positioning is like arriving in sort of conversation with the archive, not as scholars first of all, but arriving as, in my case, like an undergraduate student.
Yes.
In the mid 90s, mid to late 90s, and then you similarly, I think, arrived as like
master's student in, I'm going to say 2012.
Yeah, like 2012, right? So we collide with CTR and kind of collide even with the idea of Canadian theater in complicated and different ways than certainly I think a lot of our colleagues who were editors of the journal, going all the way back to like the right at the start. One of the things when we were talking that I said I find really has been fascinating about this journey back through the archive is the notion that like CTR is, secondary source. Like there's a lot of like writing about shows, writing about performance events, analysis of those things. But looking at it as a primary source that, sort of through that historiographic lens of the, like it's a primary document of the establishing of like Canadian theater scholarship in a lot of ways. The documenting of Canadian theater while simultaneously almost kind of like a creating of a sense of Canadian theater. The practice is sort of exploding at the same time as the documenting of the practice is exploding. And what I said earlier was I was in reading like the first issue was how high stakes things seem. By comparison to, I guess, where they kind of feel right now. We had spoken earlier about like, what were the first Canadian plays that we encountered? What were the first plays that we studied? And I think to sum up, the stories are probably still similar, which is there were not a lot that we encountered. They were really interesting and like important experiences. But I mean, in my case, like encountering some of them, I kind of vaguely knew they were Canadian, but I didn't know who Judith Thompson or Sharon Pollock or Brad Fraser or any of these folks were when I first saw the show. I learned that later.
Yeah.
It's not, but it didn't feel it didn't feel as high stakes. Certainly, like we asked the question, like, what is a Canadian identity? That was a very
Mm-hmm.
90s question. Kept trying to define what is Canadian theater and
Mm-hmm.
problematizing the definitions. That was
Mm-hmm.
certainly kind of what we did in the 90s. Uh, and that has since kind of it's sort of become a thing that people sort of eye roll at a little
Yeah,
bit, which is why
sure.
my project isn't about defining the Canadian musical, because that's
Mm-hmm.
just seems a bit reductive
Mm-hmm.
or a fool's errand, or maybe both. Um, but it's interesting to go back and read these at the start and how passionate and like high stakes they feel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what I'm getting out of this, how can I? It's funny because, oh, what do I want to say? My brain. What I like about so the first ever edition, they write about who is this for, what is the purpose of
Mm.
this particular magazine. That it's not for a highbrow intellectual audience. That it is for and by the creators of theater, people who make theater.
Yeah, do you want me to read that?
Yeah, let's read that because I think that's key to like a launching point
Yeah,
for us.
so the Canadian Theatre Review is a magazine about Canada today, which means to some extent that it's also a magazine about Canada as it existed in the past and as it may exist in the years to come.
Hmm.
Also, I think it's interesting that they call it a magazine, a journal.
Yeah.
There are, although I don't, we'd have to go back to ask them what those words meant in
Hmm.
1974, to be
Hmm.
honest. There are, of course, many magazines in existence which, in one way or another, deal with Canada. What makes CTR unique is its perspective. Canada as seen through the eyes of its theater artists. This is our view, our own way in. In order that our viewpoint remain clear, we must primarily reach those who create the theater, playwrights, directors, actors, designers, and critics. Without this base of support, our work is meaningless in any but an academic context. That we want to reach others, the administrators, arts council members, educators, students of theater, those members of the audience who are concerned, is obvious. But primarily, CTR is a professional journal for those working in and for the theatrical profession.
Hmm.
And then here are their declarations of what it must never become, which I thought were really interesting.
Yes.
It must never be allowed to become a purely literary journal aimed at an intellectual elite.
Hmm.
Conversely, it must never be allowed to become a publicity tool to promote the theatrical product of Canada to the buyers of the world.
Hmm.
It must never be allowed to become a popular magazine at the expense of avoiding the issues of the day. I think that's really interesting. So it's that we were talking about that tension that CTR, I think, em- embodies. Can you embody if you're a magazine?
Yeah.
But it exists at this intersection between uh, aiming at the creators, the theater makers, the theater interested,
Mm-hmm.
the person that I'm talking about, who I inherited half the archive
Yes.
from,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then the theater scholars and the academics who I am myself now positioned with,
Mm-hmm.
but also inherited another part of the archive from, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because it occurs to me some of these are also inherited from when Natalie Rewell retired
Right.
and left us with an archive. And so I got all of her doubles. And
Mm-hmm.
so that tension, that intersection, which I think when we were talking earlier, I described it like it's like almost like a dialectical,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's not a binary.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's in constant negotiation and renegotiation
Mm-hmm.
and in tension and in collaboration, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's
Mm-hmm.
a really interesting weaving together of those things, and it's laid out right here in the intro.
Yeah. 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 I think what's interesting to me about thinking about Canadian theater and why theater and all and why CTR, right? Like why a magazine at all is and now that you read it again, because it's now the third time that you and I have heard that, I'm realizing, oh, maybe it's not, it's actually a triptych. There's actually in what it's not, right? In that call for like
Mm-hmm.
and so it's not a promotional tool,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so there's this question of the commercialism of theater, the industry of theater, the business of theater. It's not a peer reviewed journal. So then that to me is the ivory tower of theater,
Mhm.
the academe of theater, the theater that's so far removed from the stage that, is it like, what is it? What is its purpose? Perhaps you could ask. And then there's the third one is uh it is also responding to the issues of the day. There's also a
Mhm.
question of some kind of um I don't know, theater review. There is a criticism, there is a
Mhm.
critique, there is a critical thinking, there's something political or urgent or emergent. And I think that's maybe what I hadn't realized till now is interesting about the potential of this particular world we're in, is where do those three things meet, right?
Yeah.
And it's defining itself in its negation, which is maybe not super useful to us. It's not those
But in the
things.
90s, that was a very Canadian thing to do.
Right, yeah. We're definitely not this stuff.
We're
But then,
definitely, what's Canadian identity? It's not these. That
yeah,
was the very
yes, that's
90s
right,
thing.
that's right. And so then what is it? So then it's what I'm hearing is it's practical, uh, in some ways. It is academic, but it's academic in a way that's grounded in
Hmm.
industry and practice, and it's political in some ways,
Hmm.
or at least engaged in responding to a kind of contemporary moment.
There's a project,
Yeah.
and they're like it's not positioned as merely a venue of analysis
Yes. Yeah.
and documentation
Hmm.
and um, and sort of uh, commentary. It has a project.
Hmm.
Like it seeks to influence as much as it seeks to
Hmm.
document and chronicle.
Yeah.
I mean,
Absolutely.
that's the other
Yeah.
thing that we thought was really hilarious about
Yeah.
this, like right at the start, editorial
Mm.
viewpoint, right? So they talk about like, here's what we got. Like, here's
Mm.
what's as you would in your intro, as CTR always has done. Here's what will be featured.
Hmm.
We got some bits on design and directing. We got some bits on a historical overview of English theater, French Canadian theater. We have a quote, sharp attack by George Riga on theater which avoids the social issues of its day. And we have an interview with Robin Phillips, very recently hired to become artistic director of Stratford Festival, which they describe as an interview with Robin Phillips, the Stratford Festival's latest contribution to national unity,
Mm.
which is a pretty sarcastic
Yeah. It sense them being
line.
sassy.
I think it's pretty sassy. I didn't read it as sassy the first time I read it. I'm like, what? And then later I realized, oh, that's very sassy.
Yeah.
Because in the second half of the editorial viewpoint, they flat out, in an issue where they have an interview with the man, they call for they call for the board of the Stratford Festival to withdraw his appointment. Right? CTR would like to add its own voice to the ever-growing number of concerned Canadians demanding that Mr. Phillips' appointment be immediately withdrawn by the backward-looking board of the Stratford Festival. Uh,
That's wild. Yeah.
it's wild.
Yeah.
And I think what's actually more interesting is that we both respond to it by saying that's wild.
Well, and could you, like, to me
I would
what's
like to know
beautiful
how.
and baffling about it
Mhm.
is, like, could you imagine us today come being like, all right, here we go, we're co-editing an issue on whatever it is, on the Timbit musical, God,
Yeah.
and we're like, by the way, like, here's our like, we call for the dismissal of someone, like, that to me is
We
so,
call for the dismantling of the Canada Council.
yeah, tear it to the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As the editors
Yeah. Yeah.
of the journal in its
This issue.
initial
Yeah.
issue.
It's great.
And I mean, it's Don Rubin, and it's signed Don Rubin, Stephen Maisie, and Ross Stewart, right? And I mean, I'm just checking the bios, the notes on the contributors. There's no notes on Ross or on Stephen in the bios, but I mean, Don is full-on assistant professor at York
Right.
at this point. So it's not like they're unaffiliated and just
Mm.
kind of like,
Yeah.
like it's not that we're not looking at like Hunter S. Thompson
Well,
like writing about this
yeah,
from his
yeah, yeah.
van
It's literally what I was
on
thinking
the
was like
road. Like
gonzo journalism kind of stuff. Yeah, yeah,
this
yeah.
is sitting there like positioned in the world of academic journals right? Like York is publishing this. It's shaped and looks like all the other journals of the era. Like it hasn't
Yeah.
even moved to the
Yeah.
more kind of
Magazine
magazine
style. Yeah.
style, even though they refer to it as a magazine. So it's just wild that
they'd have such a strong opinion. But I think that's what's interesting about it is like, have we lost the ability to state strong opinions about theater? I think like when you and I, about Canadian theater specifically, right? Because when you and I first met to talk about what we were going to do when we sat down and did this, I feel like we had a lot of opinions that we then didn't don't necessarily feel compelled to share in front of a camera to an unknowing future witness
mhm,
who might, judge us for whatever we think about whoever, right? Can we go through and pick up one of these things and be like, oh, I saw that play, it was horrible,
mhm.
like, are we allowed to have opinions about Canadian theater? And there's something so refreshing to me about someone coming in just such a strong opinion right away. And I think that's what I like about it is like when you really care about something, you build a strong opinion, I suppose, about it. I don't know really where I'm going with that.
It's
But
also there's a bit of the run of the asshole
for
that's
sure.
going on
Oh
here,
yeah.
right?
I
Like
mean,
it's
let's be real.
combative,
Yes.
it's rude, it's impolite.
Yeah.
There are things about that I like, and there are things about that I don't like.
Yeah. Well, there's also like, stinks of privilege. God bless them all. But let's be real. It's easy to have an opinion when you're in a position where having an opinion won't interrupt your livelihood in a serious way.
That's true.
Yeah.
Although interestingly, like in the collection of people writing for this, I'll just read you like
Yeah.
what their jobs are on the notes on contributors page.
Mm.
Canadian representative of Actors Equity Association, because there isn't a Canadian Actors Equity at this point.
Right.
Um, Author of the play, and as well as many radio and television plays.
Mm-hmm.
Freelance theater critic living in Toronto, formerly theater critic for Peterborough Examiner, founder and artistic director of the Factory Theater Lab, freelance theater critic living in Montreal, freelance theater critic and former dramaturge, director, founder and artistic director of Savage God Theater Project in Vancouver, artistic director designate of the Stratford Festival. I mean, that would be Robin Phillips. Theater critic for the Calgary Herald. Author of The Ecstasy of Rita Joe. Assistant professor of dramatic literature and criticism at York. Assistant professor of dramatic literature at York. Teaches directing at the University of Alberta. Founder of Edmonton's Theatre 3. Assistant professor at UBC. Resident designer of the Shaw Festival. Member of the Stratford Festival Acting Company. And I love this one. Anton Wagner is currently studying for his doctorate in Canadian theatre at the Centre for the Study of Drama at the University of Toronto.
Aww.
Like, what a beautiful sense of the arc of history.
Mm.
So it's the mix that they
Yeah.
talk about, right? Like
Right.
some of the folks here definitely have that
Yeah.
position from which
Yeah.
they can have
Yeah, you have a nice mix of
an
freelance
opinion.
and
And then some other folks,
established. Yeah.
maybe not so much.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting, I guess that's why I'd say it's really interesting to look at this as a primary document because it feels rich
Mhm.
in terms of there's negotiations and conversations and debates happening
Mhm.
within
Yeah. That this contemporary moment.
the conversation about other things is also the conversation about Canadian theater itself.
Yeah.
That's under it's so still under negotiation.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah, it's really cool.
There's one I want to pull up because it's been taps in. I don't know if I'll be able to find it now.
Well, while you do that,
Yeah.
let me explain to them the other game we played.
Oh yeah.
When we were playing with the archive.
Yes.
And playing with the archive as well, I'll call you a youngin. I'm not so much a youngin anymore, but certainly as people who first encountered the archive as youngins.
Yes.
Is we were flipping through these physical material objects, and they have pictures, and so we were finding our CTR cuties.
Oh, they're all so cute.
And so one of the first ones we found was from this first issue. I'll bring it up here to the camera. Nicholas Pinnell and Martha Henry. Goodness gracious.
Such cuties.
Movie stars.
What cuties!
How beautiful. And then similarly, both Thea and I at various points have like briefly met Ken Gass, who would not remember either of us, I guarantee you. Um, but like anybody else, I think who's probably over the age of like 31 in Canada, working in or adjacent to the theater, they probably met Ken Gass.
Okay. It's around.
But you know, if we want to go CTR cuties,
Look how cute.
absolutely adorable, and that hairstyle
Ugh.
has literally in the last 2 years come back in
No,
style.
and those brows. Look at his
Yeah.
brows. It's
Now,
amazing.
does
It's
Ken
insane.
still have the ability to grow that haircut? I don't know. I don't. Um,
His brows tell a story.
but we jokingly say that. But what also exists alongside that, and this is what I think is so compelling about this as an archive, is an interview with Ken, who's a person that both of us met as establishment.
100%.
Do you know what I mean? Like as
I think he had officially stepped down from factory or something.
which time, right? Like that's what I mean. Like when I met him, he was like back.
Yeah.
Yes. And so and not and I chose my word carefully. It's not just established, but establishment. And of course,
Yes.
because it's just a function of
Yeah.
age differential. Like but here we have this like 20 something who's the age of our undergrads.
Yeah.
And there's an interview with him, right? It's not purely just somebody's writing a critical appraisal of, or and it's also an interview with Ken, not as like Ken Gass, artistic director and founder of the legendary Factory Theater. In 1974, the Factory is kind of exciting, but the Factory is just as likely to collapse as it is to survive for 45 years, right? You've also got um, like John Giuliani in here talking about Savage God Theater Project, and there is no Savage God Theater Project around 50 years later.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Whereas, no, I mean, the Giuliani name still exists in Canadian theater in interesting ways, but like, there's no knowledge that Ken Gass will become Ken Gass in the establishment sense. That this is somebody who is just really still near the start here. And is kind of just like a young um, artist doing a lot of interesting things, but we have this conversation with him.
This moment that is, this moment that's captured, and that we can kind of, with the where we are now, look back and be like, what a cutie.
Well, because like basically everybody's new.
Yes, right.
In what is sort of being figured out might be Canadian theater at this point. And so you have, you know, Maver Moore is writing in this initial issue, but Maver is maybe of all the people here to these folks like the establishment figure. But there aren't that many. Everybody else here is like new. Like Don Rubin is super young here. Anton Wagner is still a graduate student. Right? Like George Riga is sort of
had just, or no, well, not just, but had.
But this is 7 years. 7 years after Ecstasy of Rita Joe.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I just written
7 years.
Yeah, because it was the centennial, right? That he
Yeah.
wrote for. Yeah.
Like that's, if we think back, like we're 2024, right? We think back to 2017. That's after the election of Donald Trump.
Right.
Seems so recent.
It does, yeah.
Right? Like it seems really recent. Like this is everything's still so new here. And I think in part that comes out of the fact that it's not purely about the sort of secondary source documentation and critical response and academic analysis of the theater of its time. It has that sense of analysis and that sense of the scholarly, but mixed in with just like we just need to document what the hell's going on, and we need to do it in a way that's not People Magazine.
Yes, yeah.
Because there's stuff like shit's going down, and thank God it's one of those things of like, thank God thank God somebody decided to write the diary entries.
Yeah. So that we
Is
have that ability to kind of look back and reflect on a history of Canadian theater in this kind of very grounded, in a more grounded way.
yeah,
Yeah.
with pictures.
Yeah, with pictures. Well, and that
Like CTR Cuties
CTR
is a funny
cuties.
game, but also and a game I'm going to play with my students.
Oh, yeah, it's a great idea.
Well, because I mean, I told you, and then I'll hand it over to you. Like,
Yeah.
but I told you that one of the after teaching that course twice now, what I realized was one of the main sort of unofficial learning outcomes of the course is to instill in the students a sense of like they are Canadian theater
Yeah.
simply by merit of taking a course in a classroom at a university in Canada where we
Mm-hmm.
talk about theater and its performance in Canada,
Mm.
that they are now easily part of that lineage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, because and not just the creator lineage, but the scholarly
Mm-hmm.
lineage,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like I've worked with in my career as a student and as a scholar with um, Natalie Rewa and Harry Lane and
Mm-hmm.
Rick Knowles and Alan Filewad and Jen Stevenson, and who are all previous editors. You worked with
Mm-hmm.
Laura Levin and Marley Schweitzer,
Mm-hmm.
previous editors. Um, and then, I mean, we both know a whole bunch of people who know a whole bunch of people. Like that's how
Yeah.
Canadian theater operates.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is a kind of, on the academic side anyways, kind of like beautifully small community
Yep.
in its own way, right? Like the
And
10
so,
people who will see this will
right?
know us.
Until this
So,
is somehow uncovered like 75 years from now.
oh God, and then we'll be the archive that, and then our stupid opinions will be subject to critique and judgment from the future generation
Yeah,
if
there you
we
go. Right?
can be so lucky. Okay, I want to. So we kind of talked about the what I'm gonna predict the future, which
Uh-oh.
is that there'll be a conservative government, and that will impact arts funding, and that will impact the survival of some of our
Right.
theaters. And I this Ann Wilson has a in 95, spring of 95, CTR Creative Economies, which is just I love that.
Nice.
This isn't that beautiful? But like talks about Ann Wilson talks about this idea of the Canada Council
Mhm.
taking away organizational funding because of you know the sort of like here I'll just read a section of this, which is in a letter dated the 20th of June 1994. I'm not going to read these names.
From Mary Pat Mombercat and
Thanks.
Sue
Oh yeah,
Morrison.
there they are. The co-artistic directors of Theatre Resource Centre were informed that Canada Council had, quote, decided on the recommendation of the Theatre Advisory Committee and the Theatre Section not to participate in the activities of the Theatre Resource Centre with a multi-year operating grant. So they find that they are losing their funding, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just the reflection on like some of what this article covers, and I teach this when we look at grants, when I teach grants, is I think really interesting to think about then what's coming up, that we're going to have this moment. And one thing they say is like, there's a lot of things they say, but like, is theater like, we talk about a theater community. Are we really a theater community, right? Like we talk about, here. It strikes me as obvious that the moment that someone becomes an officer of the Canada Council or a member of its committees, that the individual ceases to be a peer, right? This idea of peer review, a member of the imagined community of theater practitioners. What clearly distinguishes those individuals from others working in theater is that they're the select few serving on the Canada Council in some capacity participate in the process of granting money. Anyways, it goes on. And then there's another section on boards, which I think is really interesting because we're now like, I have not read this, but like, the cult of volunteerism, boards see no problem replacing paid employees with volunteers.
Yeah,
like
the
these.
bio of the person who wrote it.
Oh, I don't know. It's a good question. Is that in the back?
Don Buzik is usually is at the end of the writing, but
I don't know if it is in that one. Yeah.
Hmm.
And then there's an ad of
No.
Cyberwomb, which
I think it's the poster for the play.
Oh,
maybe.
poster for the play.
Or maybe it is an ad.
Yeah.
Still cool.
Still cool.
Oh, that's cool. I want to go see
Cyber/womb, which sounds great. But this idea of like, think about your ideal board meeting. Spaces, service organizations. It's just interesting to me to think about the ways in which things in the 90s, 95 are going to reperform themselves in the 2020s.
Well, and I'm also really fascinated with the fact that there is an article in here next to what Anne was writing. And I also I've been fortunate to work with Anne Wilson too. Um, where this is somebody saying, like, think about your ideal board meeting. At one point, when I was working with the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, they were in tough negotiations with the board of the ROM. So, like, again, the audience that this is pitched for is not purely within the walls of the academy, right? Like, this goes again to that trifecta you've been talking about.
Yeah, well, and to me, it speaks to what like Yvette Nolan is writing about governance models and oh shoot, the wonderful folks in Toronto.
Well, you're going to learn that Thea and I are both terrible at remembering names and play titles.
It's truly, we've been here all day, so it's like.
But even at the start, we weren't any good.
No, it's true. Generator TO. They published recently a whole like a whole section on governance in theater. And so my question is like, where is that? Like that to me. So we have a recent edition. Where is that content? You know what I mean? Like, where is this one? Looks good. This one looks new. 190 intersection allyship action. Like, where? Maybe. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, where
is it still in here?
Yeah. Where's the practice? Where's the admin? Where's the industry critique? And maybe that is what maybe I'm just not seeing it. I don't know.
I think it's an interest. I mean, there is still some. Right? Like in this one, in Acts of Preservation, right? Sure, Lookter's writing about a couple of live art performances they worked on. Like, this has a few folks, like, because I remember this one was, I think, at the intersection of, is this at museums and.
Yeah, this one's augmented reality ASL and this one's about disability, I think, broadly. Oh yeah, that makes sense.
So there's some cataloging of like when things are happening, and there's some writing by performance makers that I think is still pretty valuable here, and graduate students and scholars. And so, like, I think that the value is still, and the great amounts of photos, it's still there.
Yeah, I think so too.
But there is, I think it's always valid and valuable to toss out the reminder of who's the audience.
Yeah.
And I think this is a question that, frankly, we as a community of scholars probably need to reflect upon, is who's in the tent.
Yeah.
Like, who are we wanting in the tent here?
And the difference between who is the audience back in 74 versus who is the audience now, I think speaks. There's a lot of energy behind that particular question for me.
Because I know that, when one is editing one of these things, from experience, there's definitely a challenge when you reach out to folks who are not operating within the academy.
Yes.
In terms of meeting publication deadlines, in terms of, like, you have to then teach somebody about correcting proofs.
Well, and also
about photo.
Contributors don't get paid very much to contribute.
Absolutely not. And so,
no, but they do get paid, which is nice.
So it's quite. I mean, if I'm asked to write something for one of these, I maybe am not being paid much, but it goes on my CV.
Yes.
In important ways for working within the academy. But where are the values outside of that? So, like, when I co-edited this one with Jen Stevenson on Canadian musicals, it was in that thing of what I'm talking about, that feeling of like, these are time capsules. And so we had gone back, and I was looking at, like, when do musicals get mentioned? And there's an issue, like in issue 4, Ross Stewart writes a bit about musicals. It kind of does like a state of where things are at. There's an issue in like 92, I think, that's like about music theater. There's not much other than that. But they are these really interesting time capsules of what was going on at the time.
sure. Yeah.
And they're a time capsule of
Oh, I'm just gonna
nice.
pandemic time capsule. I'm just gonna time capsule your time capsule.
This is really cool.
Yeah.
And so it's the sense of like what was happening at the time and where, but there's kind of like a time capsule of what was being created and made.
Mm.
Then there's also the being a time capsule of where academia and scholarship were at. And I think Canadian Theatre Review kind of is doing both in ways that are interesting and always in tension, but always maybe something to keep an eye on. One of the things we did when we were doing this issue is try to get as many young artists, as many 22-year-old Ken Gasses as we could in the issue as possible. So we did a lot of roundtables. We did a lot of interviews. I traveled all over the place. I invited folks like Rob Kempson to write about musicals as a writer. And now currently he's artistic director out in Port Hope, right? But we also, like, this has an article by Corey Payette about the development of Children of God. So, and this is in 2017, but also Colby Wardell, who was an actor in Ride the Cyclone in all of its iterations through the Fringe out with Atomic Vaudeville in Victoria, to the tour across the country, to then when it got picked up for development through a few theaters in the US, ended up off Broadway. Colby's the one recurring performer. And so it's really just Colby writing about their journey over 8 years with the show. And those are mixed in with, say, like a more academic, scholarly article by Barry Freeman about, understanding reception of Come From Away as a Newfoundlander. And some of these folks have continued to write musicals, some don't. But the documents are there of some established artists and some completely brand new people, right? Like we had someone who had just graduated from here at Queen's, who then went down to New York to do the master's in musical theater writing, interview Leslie Ard.
Cool. Very cool.
And it was in that spirit of one audience that, I was thinking towards was the audience of 2017, but the person I was really thinking towards was the undergraduate student in 2037.
Right. Yeah.
Right, who grabs this
and goes,
because,
oh, thank God, there's a musical issue that I can now reflect upon. What was going on in 2017 that I can now write about it.
And this is a gateway, right? Like this stuff isn't being written about elsewhere. It exists kind of on the internet.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know, when I go to Spotify, I got to know what album I'm going to listen to.
Yeah.
Or maybe the recommender engine is going to recommend some other Taylor Swift album. Yeah. Because that's just all it recommends. Even though I don't listen to Taylor Swift's albums, I like her, but please stop recommending. But like the browsing is
the algorithm of content, or the way algorithm kind of like curates content for us in the world, even through search engines, does not bring, Canadian Theatre Review does not float to the top of that algorithm.
And I love that these are. Did you find another? Oh, you found
another cutie.
What'd you find?
This is Sydney Quest.
Oh.
I just think they're so cute.
Right. Now I want to know about them.
Right? Don't you want to know about Sydney Quest? Another, you know what? I just like eyebrows, I think.
This is also Rita Baiga on the cover of this, I think, before Canada's Drag Race. Right?
Yeah, 100%. That's why I grabbed it.
Or, I mean, for instance, the other thing I really liked is like the Canadian Theatre Review themes its issues. So it's also not sort of like a journal of 4 not connected scholarly articles. And that proved to be really useful when I was teaching that course, because I walked in with a stack of them with these students, and I'm like, okay, who wants the one on musicals? Who wants the one on drag? Who wants the one on preservation of museums and exhibits? And who wants the one on performance art? Who wants the one, right? Like that was really cool. And it's interesting to see how that's changed over the years. Yeah. There's the sort of time frame where they kind of went regional. And then there's where that's kind of over there, they go regional. Yeah. Jewish performance. We've certainly kind of leaned into a lot of performance studies related topics more recently. which has been interesting.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about the kind of like theater studies versus performance studies. And when I was coming up in my master's, everyone was adding performance to the title. You know, you weren't getting a master's in theater studies, you were getting a master's in theater and performance studies, right? And the way performance studies has, I think, shifted and influenced some of the Canadian theater history. I have two thoughts for you.
Yes.
One,
maybe sort of our like closing thoughts, or moving towards the end.
I don't know. Yeah, let's
see where we
wrap
go.
it up. One thought is in Theater of the Unimpressed, Jordan Tannehill compares theater to music and is like, okay, you know, someone doesn't hear like one, you know, Taylor Swift song and then hate all of music, but someone will see one bad play and then hate all of theater. And I think in some of our conversations, and maybe, you know, like what I'm interested in is this idea of the breadth of theater, you know, the different genres of theater, the musicals, the drag, the political theater, the fringe, the, you know, Toronto theater, whatever it is. And so my one question is like, does CTR, is it in some way expressing that breadth of theater, the many different genres of theater? The second question I have, which is maybe just to point out a gap, is where, okay, yes, we're talking about theater creators. Where's production? Where's the addition on production?
It's in there.
Is it?
Yeah, there's quite a good set of. It's been a while.
There's one on design.
It's been a while, but there are a few on production. And then you'll get into like the digital performance one there. You get into sort of production surrounding the digital performance.
This design training in Canada.
There's certainly some good sort of production ones that are earlier. I'm
just curious, you know, because I think when we think about.
But I agree, that's a really good question to ask.
And what are the ways in which, I guess, what are the ways in which we are reifying what Canadian theater is with what the second we make a primary source, right? And say, this is what we're doing. We're then informing a future generation. Like you say, this is what Canadian theater was at my time, right? What I'm curious about is like, who's left out of that archive?
Yeah.
And I think there still are a lot of people who are.
So in this first issue, right? Don Rubin very famously writes Creeping Towards a Culture, the theater in English Canada since 1945, which lays out an argument that really focuses what Canadian theater going forward should be around the figure of the playwright.
Yes, interesting.
Right?
Right.
And I think that bears out in a lot of the first decade, at least, of the scholarship. And I mean, it's every single one of the issues of Canadian theater prints a play script.
Yes.
Or a performance score of some sort, as opposed to, say, a scenographic documentation of a production, right? So you're getting, you know, you're going to get like the libretto to an opera, as opposed to, you know, like a photo collection of Michael Levine's work on a particular opera. And I'm sure if Natalie Rewa is watching this right now, Natalie Rewa is like jumping up and down and cheering for that thought, as someone who's, you know, done enormous work to try and document scenography in Canada. And there's real challenges to that. I mean, the still image is not a great mechanism. I know CTR has been accompanying over the last decade a lot of the issues with the online feature. I don't know if you had to do the online feature for yours. Our online feature was.
We did. I think we got someone else to do it. I'm like totally.
Ours was a photo essay on some of the work that Catalyst was doing in Edmonton, and a lot of Renyck's designs in particular.
Yeah, ours came out summer 2020 or just immediately after. It might have been the fall 2020. So we were really ended up responding to the pandemic and you know, and it was not what we had pitched. Ours, sorry, when I say ours, me and Dr. Signe Lynch co-edited I think it's 186 or something like that, Theater After the Explosion, which we had originally pitched as a what is the state of interdisciplinarity in theater? So we were inspired by like I can't even think of a good example. The many plays in which aren't just theater, but are theater and dance theater and music theater, and like the pop star one that one artist was doing.
Oh, How to Fail as a Pop Star.
Yes,
yeah,
we were interested in that as a kind of one primary example. Anyway, so but then 2020 happened. March 2020 happened. All of our deadlines were kind of, I think, like June, July 2020, and with the kind of with what happened with George Floyd, with the kind of racial reckoning that was happening both in Canada and the States, our this idea of theater after the explosion all of a sudden was no longer an explosion of interdisciplinarity, but an explosion of a kind of just an explosion of a bunch of things, right? Anyway, so
explosion.
Things exploded, right? But I think Nick Green and his social distancing theater website ended up being we had reached out to him for a totally different reason, but he ended up writing about social distancing theater, and I think our online portion was all the different examples of social distancing theater. With Nick Green's particular website. Anyway, sorry.
Well, I mean, that online stuff is great. It's the worry is, where does it go?
Yeah.
Like, what happens? Like this, I just stumbled across. And what's funny is this issue was not part of our pile.
Right.
This was sitting to the right of me on this bookshelf. I think this is part of Chick Reed's collection. And in this one, it's spring of 1982. And you've got Don Rubin starting with a history of Canadian theatre and history as a subject in Canadian drama. And Mavor Moore's writing right after him, The Myths That Plague Canadian Culture and Exploration by the Chairman of the Canada Council. Like, this is a great pairing to put in conversation with each other.
Yeah.
And then you put it in with what Alan and Rick write about 20 years of Canadian theatre review in 1994. And being able to put the conversation together now through this whole archive. And there's a lot of repeating characters. Don and Mavor repeat.
Yes.
Rick and Alan talk about Don and Mavor in here, right? And so looking at it as like a story. I mean, here you go, 1994. Has Canadian theatre a future? Mavor Moore thinks so, but it won't be easy. Right? Like, even simply tracking Mavor's conversations.
Yeah.
And it's interesting where Mavor's is positioned, because Mavor arrives, like Canadian Theatre Review in 1974 arrives, and Mavor's already establishment, right? He's been working actively in the theatre since the late 40s, 50s. And in Canadian media, right, in television, and is a major voice, a major cultural voice.
Well, and you have the same thing of these kind of the Don Rubins and the Mavor Moores, and then you also have, the Laura Levins, the Jen Stevensons of the kind of generation we grew up with.
The illustrious Jen Stevenson.
The illustrious Jen Stevenson. Heard nothing but good things. But there's something. Like, I think there is I think when we first talked about this, we were like, well, maybe we just organize them all by editor, know? And that, to me, is an interesting way of archiving this archive.
Organize them by color. Organize them by
cuties.
The cuties?
I'm desperate to find another cutie before we leave.
Well, here, why don't you look in this one? Because you should take this one with you.
Which one's that?
The New Saskatchewan.
Oh,
before you go, since that's where you're headed for.
I know, but I'm sad about it. I mean, I'm happy about it, but I'm also sad.
Well, wait until you see all the cuties that are in Saskatchewan, and then you're going to be happy to go.
I'm down for some Saskatoon cuties. Manifestos. Everything you want to say about theater, but we're afraid to put in print. Such a good title.
That's a great issue.
Yeah, what a good cover, too. Yes, I've assigned this.
I mean...
Cutie?
Oh! Legendary cutie.
Yes, legendary cutie. Of cutie fame. Can't get cuter than just tearing it all down, building it back up through theater.
Like, there's some irreverence with the archive that I think is super valuable, and there's some reverence with this archive that's super valuable. I mean, I think maybe the way to kind of close is our conversation also comes at a time where there are major questions occurring about why CTR or even if CTR, right, should continue. The when it comes to these kind of like printed journal things, there is still an academic market somewhat. There isn't necessarily a non-academic market for magazines at the same
question,
way, right?
yeah. Do
And
practitioners read CTR? Possibly not, right?
Well, do people read magazines?
Right.
Like
right, yeah.
but then is that a reason to either A, shut the thing down, or B, allow the thing to drift away from one of the don't ever do this things from the beginning
Yeah.
and get increasingly pulled into the academic journal orbit? I think fiscally or economically, if the thing's going to survive, it's going to have to survive within the umbrella of academia. But here's the thing, that's where it started.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, right now it's University of Toronto Press, but it was York University.
Yeah.
Like it was these university drama departments.
Yeah, that were editing.
That were publishing and editing the thing. Yeah. Right? Like it's
well, and maybe that's the responsibility of academia, is to archive the practice that is happening, and is just kind of.
Well, it is. We're well, not those of us who are contract instructors aren't, but like tenured professors are paid for service.
Yes. Yeah.
That's part of the service. But is there still a desire to catalog theater and its performance in Canada? And I think that's a really complicated question. What I will say is, I think if we let those cataloging projects die, we're going to be shooting ourselves in the foot, and we're going to do that thing where, as everybody does, where 20 years later you look back and you go, fuck, I wish I'd written that down.
Yeah.
Right? I wish I had interviewed that person before they died. I wish I had written that journal entry. Yeah. Like, I'm a person who can't keep a journal. It's just not in my nature.
Yeah.
But I do keep an archive of certain things. Like, I have some programs, I have some photos, I have some of these things. This is essentially the keeping of programs for the people who don't keep programs.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm looking right in here. I just have, so here's the Weyburn Project, right? Which is so cool. But in this, where was it? Here we go. So, core members of General Fools, Regina, Saskatchewan. A few names: Amy Matizio, Rob Appleby, Michael Krahuski, Jaden Pfeiffer, Mike Fly, Steve Torgerson, and Tatiana Maslany. Emmy Award winner, She-Hulk, Orphan Black, Tatiana Maslany. This happens all the time.
Right.
Because, again, this is the archive where people who are not necessarily established or are anybody still show up in the magazine as opposed to necessarily show up in the journal. To me, it feels like if there is an argument for continuing, it's that it still exists in that space where very little other scholarship exists, which is trying to create somewhere where the creation, the making of theater and performance is being discussed and chronicled by all of the folks who work on it. And in a way that isn't just a glossy popular magazine, but also in a way that doesn't abandon what are some of the benefits of being a glossy popular magazine.
Sure, yeah.
You know, like the move to color pictures is so exciting later on, right?
And I think, like, to me, to just yes and till we're blue in the face is like, if we don't have CTR, where does Canadian performance and theater discourse occur? And it's not just, it's sure in the classroom, maybe in, the odd, conference. But if this particular magazine does not exist, ooh, I found something.
And where does it occur?
Ooh, I found a map.
Where does it occur for people who don't live in Toronto
Yeah.
or Vancouver or aren't in graduate studies or working at a university? Oh,
That's nice. This says anxiety. Is this yours?
no, that's immersive theater.
That's immersive theater for you.
Co-edited by Natalie Alvarez,
Yep.
who was on faculty somewhere, and at this point, Aaron
She's at
Willis, who
TN.
was not. At this point of the writing of this, I don't think, right?
Pan-Canadian collaboration presented by Theater Yes, November 24th, December 7th, 2016.
Yeah. Anyway, I feel like
It's a little gift I got.
after spending time with it, my feeling of like if CTR really feels like yes.
Yes. They're great. They're beautiful. They're beautiful books.
It's a remarkable archive.
It is.
It's a remarkable primary source.
Yes.
And a remarkable secondary source.
It's a good place too. Like I think Concord Floral is in this one.
Yes, it is.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. And yeah.
And so reminds me I gotta go renew my subscription.
Yes, let's both go do that.
Especially all of us who have professional expense
Yes.
accounts through our varying jobs and positions of privilege.
Yeah, or
we should
even
all
if
renew our subscriptions.
You can write it off if you use it for.
Yeah.
If you're a working artist, you can write off CTR.
Maybe I'll just buy 2 subscriptions.
Yeah, write it off.
All right.
Here, I should put that one back into immersive theater, probably.
Yeah, and make sure you don't forget the New Saskatchewan one.
I listen. I'll take it if no one wants it.
Well, you need to figure out where the heck you're going.
Oh my god, no kidding. Yeah. Oh, I saw this Salon Automate. I saw the French version. Anyways, sorry, distracted. She performs with puppets, life-size puppets.
This is the point where we can do that artful fade out while we're just sort of talking to each other and forgetting about our audience.
Yeah, it's like the whole thing she performs. These like life-size puppets that.
Okay, so you're having your sandwich. We're sitting here with a pile of Canadian theater reviews, which I have somewhat sorted according to the various looks. All of the past editors will nerd out over this, although I gotta fix the top.
It is nice
here because what did I put over there? This is more appropriate. That's it. There we go. Thank you. And there may be another look in there somewhere, but this is just all the issues that I had access to. Some of them are mine. I'd say probably the last decade are mine. And then a lot of what's over here was donated to the department by, I drove out to like north of Kingston, about 45 minutes to pick up boxes of books from a guy who is a retired chemistry professor. But his wife had been someone who had returned to university later in life, and drama was one of the things that she loved and studied. She would drag him to the festivals. I had like a full run of Stratford Festival season programs from this as well. And she was a subscriber to a lot of these. And she had passed away. Okay. And so all of these had been sitting up in the boxes in their shed, I think, for the last couple of years, and he really didn't want to throw them out. He wanted to see if there was another home for them, and so I went and picked them up and brought them down here, and they live here in the department, basement of Theological Hall in Kingston, Ontario, at Queen's University.
Here we are.
But yeah, I thought actually that's an interesting kind of origin story for a bunch of these. because they weren't rescued out of the basement of a theater scholar. Right? They weren't an academic journal subscription for this person. This was someone who had done a lot of community theater through their life, was an avid theater goer, and then had later come here to do, as a mature student, to do a degree that included theater. But the CTRs, I think, actually predate when she came here as a mature student.
Interesting.
Right? Like this was, if you were interested, she also had theatrum, like a run of theatrum. So she had both CTR and theatrum and like quite a number going all the way back to the early 80s.
It's an impressive collection.
Yeah, as a theater goer. And then anything that's more contemporary is mine. And then the stuff up top, that first like 10 issues is certainly the first 12 issues I got from Jen Stevenson.
Right. Yeah.
Who had gathered like full sets.
Right.
And I'm borrowing the first 12. I got to get them back to her. But yeah, that's the archive we're sitting here with.